Locke, Part 4, Government and Consent. How does a man make himself subject to a government? Given Locke's presuppositions, the answer can only be by consent. If that consent is express, there is no fundamental problem to be addressed, although Locke inexplicably argues that such an express consent, once given, binds a man to remain perpetually in subjection to that government. To say that it is not obvious why such express consent must be irrevocable is to be guilty of understatement, and Locke offers us no justification for this doctrine, certainly not in that part of the text where this claim is made. What if the consent be tacit or unexpressed? How far does such a tacit consent bind? Every man, he says, that hath any possessions or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of any government, doth thereby give his tacit consent, and as is as far forth obliged to obedience to the laws of that government during such enjoyment as any one under it. Whether this his possession be of land, to him and his heirs forever, or a lodging only for a week, or whether it be barely travelling freely on the highway, and in effect it reaches as far as the very being of any one within the territories of that government. But does everyone consent to the creation of such an agency? Surely there is no evidence of this ever happening. Well, no direct evidence perhaps, but we do have some indirect evidence. And this brings us to Locke's famous or notorious notion of tacit consent. Those who live under government that, broadly speaking, does what the Lockean agency is supposed to do, namely protect everyone's property, can be deemed to have given their tacit consent to it, since someone who was really so opposed to it that he or she would prefer living in the state of nature could always take up the life of a survivalist. This tacit consent argument is not implausible, for we can and do enter into contracts by a course of conduct. The argument has often been made against the necessity for explicit consent in all cases of contract that there are well-recognized circumstances in which we can make binding contracts and agreements without engaging in any formalities. I allowed above that some contracts can be formed by a course of conduct, one of the most familiar of which is perhaps ordering a meal in a restaurant. If William orders a meal in a restaurant and consumes it, then he has incurred an obligation to pay for it. The lack of any explicit verbal or written agreement does not relieve him of his monetary obligations. One might imagine a visitor from a radically alien culture innocently failing to realize this cultural and legal norm and thinking that he was witnessing a gratuitous distribution of food with ensuing comical complications, comical at least to the onlookers, if not to the mystified alien and the out-of-pocket restaurateur. But of course, we are under no obligation to go to any restaurant at all, still less to go to this particular one rather than that. And if one were to insist that it and only it have the right to feed us, and we the corresponding obligation to pay for that food, whether we wanted to or not, we might find the argument less persuasive. This is more or less the response that David Hume gives to the tacit consent argument, arguing that where there is no real possibility of choice or secession, the most one can claim is that here we have acquiescence rather than consent, or, to use Aristotle's analysis, non-voluntary actions rather than voluntary actions. Some, such as Hume, have attempted to diffuse the residency argument by arguing that consent to be genuine must be voluntary, and that, in many cases, the demand that people either stay and obey or leave presents people with alternatives, neither of which they can really be said to choose. Hume instances the position of the unskilled peasant presented with such a choice, and deems it to be equivalent to that of a man kidnapped and taken aboard a boat without his consent, who is given the option of either consenting to the authority of the ship's master or jumping overboard. The choice is not simply to stay and obey or leave. One may also stay and not obey, a possibility that might have unpleasant consequences, but is nonetheless an option. Attempts by the state to enforce obedience in matters not covered by the principle of non-aggression will then be coercive, and those who remain will have a choice of whether to actively resist such aggression or to acquiesce in it in the face of force majeure, without such acquiescence being tantamount to any form of legitimation of the authority of the state to require such obedience. Whatever may be the case in the relatively trivial and transient contractual situations engendered by the purchase of food in a restaurant and such like, in most jurisdictions one cannot form contracts in respect of significant assets such as automobiles or houses that saddle one with significant obligations in the same casual existential manner. Randy Barnett notes that even for something as relatively trivial as the lease of a television, most legal systems require a complete account of the obligations one is taking on in return for the benefits received. That being the case, he remarks on the irony of resting our duty to obey the law on such a slender reed as that of tacit consent, so that merely by living in a certain town, or not leaving our country of birth, we have consented to obey nearly any command that is enacted by the reigning legal system. And the consent of a majority is supposed to bind not only themselves, but dissenters and future generations as well. And while it is true that entering a marriage or making a will were activities that once were informally transacted, they have since come to be attended with a significant degree of formality, so that one cannot now get married, even in Las Vegas, or make a will without being explicitly aware of just what it is one is doing. If such formality with its attendant explicit reflection and consent characterizes such important matters, how much more then is explicit reflection and explicit consent required in the matter of accepting a constitution, given that it purports to be the fundamental law by which one is to be bound? The argument is sometimes made that those who receive benefits from a state, such as the provision of housing or healthcare, the use of roads and public services, tacitly accept the legitimate authority of that state by their acceptance of such benefits. In response to this, it could be argued that such benefits, to the extent that they are actually benefits, could be regarded as positive externalities, much as your neighbour's dazzling flower display is a welcome addition to the visual delights of your neighbourhood. And just as you would be surprised to receive a bill from your neighbour for the pleasure his flower display gives you, and rightly resistance to paying it, so too the benefits provided by the state being, as it were, happy accidents, you can neither be legitimately charged for them nor required to submit to the authority of the state in return for them. After all, just as one may acquiesce passively in the negative elements of state action without thereby being taken to legitimate it, so too one can similarly acquiesce in the positive elements of state action without legitimating consequences. Simmons remarks that most citizens not unreasonably take the public goods they receive to be fully bought and paid for, indeed overpaid for, from governments with tax payments. Mandatory purchase of overpriced public goods with compulsory tax payments doesn't leave much to account for the alleged additional aspects of political obligation. In any event, even libertarians might agree that if a government along Lockean lines were to confine itself to the defence and vindication of our property rights, including, of course, our right to life and person, this is surely something we could live with. Well, maybe so, maybe not. Consider the following argument. We saw above that Locke argues, in what Eric Mack calls the like reason argument, that just as a man is bound to preserve himself, so too he is bound to preserve the rest of mankind when such preservation doesn't conflict with his duty of self-preservation. That being so, what if our Lockean government were to decide, by means of a majority decision, that our particular individual rights to external goods ought to be constrained, say by taxation or partial confiscation, to ensure the preservation of all? Even if we were to disagree with the reasons for such a decision, as long as we were in the minority, we couldn't legitimately object to the government's implementation of such a decision. Let's return to the inconveniences of the state of nature. These were, let us remind ourselves, no settled law, no independent judges, and no means of enforcement. A libertarian can concede that these are indeed problems for those of us who wish to live and associate with others. But libertarians aren't necessarily opposed to law. Certainly not natural rights libertarians who willingly concede that the non-aggression principle is a non-negotiable element of all societies, together with whatever other positive arrangements are freely entered into by individuals. Nor are libertarians necessarily committed to the exercise of self-help as the first port of call whenever there is a serious dispute that must be resolved. Just as the principle of the division of labour applies to the production and distribution of material goods, so too it makes sense to avail of arbitration and dispute resolution services to resolve our more intractable and serious problems, rather than undertake to resolve them directly ourselves. Such services, to be effective, must of course be impartial and unbiased. The need for impartiality is satisfied if there is, in any given case, someone who is willing and competent to judge. It doesn't require that there be someone particular or some agency who is willing and competent to serve in every case. In Rome, for example, any Roman citizen was competent to act as a judge in disputes between his fellow citizens. Libertarians would readily concede that judgment must be given effect. What's the point in having your dispute resolved in judgment and costs awarded to you if you cannot enforce the judgment? But the enforcement of legal judgments also doesn't require that there be a single person or agency who is competent to do the enforcing, a government, one particular agent of governance, to the excluding of all others. The only way to remedy such inconvenience is for individuals to transfer the second-level rights they possess to defend their first-order rights to an agency which undertakes to remedy these inconveniences. This, in brief, is Locke's justification for the Commonwealth. Eric Mack is particularly critical of Locke's creation of a super-agent, political society, noting that it gives rise to insuperable problems, no one of which can arise if Locke simply invokes the rights of individuals as individuals to the non-violation of their rights and to the structure of governance that they have individually authorized. In the matter of the traditional discussion of which form of government, government by the one, the many, or by all, is preferable, Locke has no fixed opinion. He rejects an absolute monarchy, but is happy to accept an hereditary monarchy, an elective monarchy, even a democracy. His preferred term for the state is commonwealth, which signifies no particular form of government as such, but rather any independent political community. The legislative power is superior to the executive power, though Locke is comfortable with the exercise of emergency powers by the executive when necessary, and indeed even the executive's exercise of a kind of equitable discretion to temper the application of laws when such might be considered too severe. While the legislative power is supreme, it is only a power taken on trust, a fiduciary power, which leaves unaltered in the people a power also described as supreme, to remove or alter the legislative power. We then appear to have two supreme powers, the legislative power and the people. It is obvious that both cannot be supreme at the same time and in the same respect, unless Locke is willing to entertain a contradiction. The charitable interpretation is to take the legislative power to be the active supreme power, with the people's power being passive or residual. Again, these themes in Locke are not unproblematic. What constitutes the limits to the equitable or discretionary exercise of power by the executive? What is to stop the executive usurping the authority of the legislative power? What justifies the executive in such actions is that it acts for the public good in circumstances where the laws do not reach, or do reach but are not fit for purpose. But the plea of the public good is elastic and can, like charity, be made to cover a multitude. In the end, Locke has little more to say than that the people, if they judge that the executive power, the prince, is acting to destroy rather than to defend their lives, liberty and estate, may consider him to be a rebel, that is, to be someone who has brought back war or aggression, and as such may resist him. It is important to be clear that Locke is not providing a charter for revolution, but only justifying, in extremis, an ultimate resistance to a government which has fundamentally forsaken its constitutive purpose and is actively waging war on its citizens. Eric Mack provides a useful summary of Locke's fundamental principles in respect of politics, and these are: 1. That every person possesses a set of natural rights to life, liberty, and estate. 2. That a person's property rights derive from his rights over himself and his labour. 3. That the legitimate function of government is the protection of the rights mentioned in 1. And 4. That the authority of a government is derived from the consent of those whom it governs. 5. That the failure of a government to protect those rights permits it to be resisted and replaced. And 6. That political authority is narrowly circumscribed and requires religious toleration. There cannot be much doubt that this is a succinct and accurate account of Locke's fundamental principles. What, if anything, is the value of Locke's contribution to contemporary discussions of rights? Communitarians and others criticize rights for promoting individualism at the expense of social solidarity. But the pursuit of an individual's welfare, based upon their rights, understood in the limited classical liberal sense and not in the expansive latter-day sense of the term, is not only compatible with the pursuit of welfare of communities, it is foundational to such a pursuit. Rights are precisely what enable individuals to discover or create diverse voluntary associations in which people with all their different proclivities can cooperate to mutual advantage. What is the relevance of Lockean thought in our modern multicultural world? Mack is emphatic in claiming that resolute depoliticalization of decision-making, rather than a futile search for more enlightened modes of political decision-making, is the fundamental Lockean formula for how wider and increasingly diverse ranges of people can peacefully coexist. Summary. Locke's conception of man is that he is naturally social, and that only certain inconveniences of his naturally social state move him to create and accept a political order. In the state of nature, Locke believes that all men are free and equal. Locke denies the Hobbesian claim that men in the state of nature are at war with each other. We have war when one man attempts to get another into his absolute power, to enslave the other. War is not a temporary or fleeting expression of hostility, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life. The state of nature, in contrast, is men living together according to reason, without a common superior on earth, with authority to judge between them. The state of nature is opposed not so much to a state of war, but rather to civil society, in which men do in fact have an authoritative superior who can judge between them. A state of war or peace can in fact be found on occasion in both the state of nature and in civil society. The possibility of war is, for Locke, the great incentive for men to enter civil society, because there, while war is still possible, its incidence is likely to be substantially decreased. Both Hobbes and Locke see man's ineliminable desire for self-preservation as the impetus which takes him from the state of nature to another and better condition, that condition being either Leviathan or civil government, which can provide the only sure remedy for man's wolfish nature or the inconveniences of the state of nature. Even in the Lockean state of nature, there is a law of nature, and that law is given to us by reason. Reason teaches us that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Or, to put it in the language of rights, every man has the right not to be harmed by another in his life, health, liberty, and possessions. The purpose of the law of nature is to bring about the peace and preservation of all mankind. The justification for the law of nature is that we are all God's creatures and his property, and as such, no man is innately superior or inferior to any other. Since there are no spontaneously operating law enforcers in the state of nature, the execution of the law of nature is left to each and every man. This law permits the restraint of those who are prepared to invade another's rights and, where they have done so, the exaction of reparation. Locke is careful to state that the exaction of reparation must be proportionate to the transgression. For Locke, property includes not only the obvious material goods which man desires and needs, but also the relatively intangible, yet very real goods of life and liberty. Property comes in two basic varieties. First, the property that one has or can have in oneself, and second, the property one has or can have in things other than oneself, in natural resources. Natural resources are either originally owned or they are originally unowned. Original common ownership of natural resources appears to be Locke's opening position. His final position seems to be that nothing is actually owned by anyone originally until it is acquired by a person's using the requisite procedure, the mixing of labour or improvement. Acquisition of natural resources is limited by the proviso Locke's second proviso, and that enough and as good be left for others. Every man has a property in his own person. Locke believes that every man possesses a natural right to life, liberty, and estate, and that each man's property rights in external things derives ultimately from his property right in himself and his labour. The state of nature, adequate as it might be at a certain stage of human development, suffers from certain obvious inconveniences. It lacks a known and settled law with which to resolve disputes. It lacks disinterested judges with the authority to determine the law in disputed cases, and it lacks the power to enforce and execute the sentences of our erstwhile judges. These inconveniences are what drive men to take refuge under the established laws of government. A government for Locke is simply an agency devised by those who desire to escape the inconveniences of nature. But the power of government can never go further than is required to remedy those inconveniences. In a compact with others, each man transfers to the Commonwealth his natural rights to look to his self-preservation and to punish offenders. The right to attend to his self-preservation is not transferred completely or finally to the Commonwealth, but only to the extent that such a transfer is consistent with his self-preservation and the preservation of the rest of society. The right to punish offenders, however, is completely and wholly transferred. The government of the Commonwealth is to operate by established and promulgated laws, these laws to be made for the good of the people. Taxes may not be raised on men's property without their consent, which consent is to be given by men themselves or their representatives. Hobbes believes that the setting up of a single authority subject to no limitation and from which there can be no secession is the only way to establish peace. Locke, on the other hand, is unable to see how such an arbitrary power could resolve the problems emerging from the state of nature. A man makes himself subject to a government by consent. Is there any evidence of this consent ever having been given? This brings us to Locke's notorious notion of tacit consent. Those who live under a government that does what the Lockean agency is supposed to do, protect everyone's property, can be deemed to have given their tacit consent to it.